Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you for being here today. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're thriving. Today we are going to be talking about opening lines and opening paragraphs, how important opening lines are, if we place too much emphasis on them, and how to kind of approach them. For me, I tend to get really hung up on writing my openings because obviously openings definitely set the tone and the feel and the atmosphere of the entire story, usually because I tend to write chronologically. Whenever I'm writing the beginning, I still don't completely know what my character's voice is. And so I can put a lot of pressure on myself to try to get it perfect right away when that's just not possible. And so personally, I spend so much time on openings, even though I shouldn't, but also I just like to have a strong opening because it's my favorite part of the story to write. But yeah, I want to talk a little bit about how I approach openings, how I make it a little bit easier on myself, and let's look at some examples. Sometimes I do wonder though, if as readers, we place too much importance on the opening lines. Because I feel like as writers, whenever we hear about what makes an effective opening, we hear all the time that opening lines need to grab the reader's attention, which is just, what does that even mean? The thing about that old adage is that it's vague and it's subjective, and it kind of belongs in that category of writing advice that's just like, obviously, but how do you actually do that? But some of my favorite books don't necessarily have opening lines that are on their own, like breathtaking, show-stopping, spectacular, never before seen. But you know, they serve their purpose. I am absolutely no expert on this, obviously. But what has helped me brainstorm opening lines is obviously reading other opening lines and figuring out why I like them and why they work. A more specific guideline that I ask myself is, what am I trying to accomplish in my opening line or paragraph? What do I want that opening image to be? And usually that comes down to one or more of the following. So let's discuss. Number one is a strange detail. The more specific, the better. Strange details can be really visceral or alarming or beautiful or just interesting. I kind of think of it as like starting the story on the tip of a triangle. You've zoomed into the most minute, mundane, weird, specific detail or thing, and then you build out the scene and the wider details like as you go on. I think what makes strange detail type openings really interesting is just the specificity, because I think when you're a little too vague, you're not like capturing the reader right away, whereas if you start on a strange image, the chances of them feeling like they're reading something familiar is sort of lessened. So a classic example of this, I feel like, is 1984 by George Orwell. It was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. This one is so effective because you have the sort of two parts of the sentence. It was a bright, cold day in April is such a normal thing. It's such a boring sentence, but then you follow it up with, and the clocks were striking 13, and it's so strange, it's unsettling, but in like a very subtle way, in a way that kind of like creeps up on you. Another example I like is the opening line of Neuromancer by William Gibson. The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel. I also really like this because of the coupling of the unexpected details. When you think sky, you think nature, you think bright blues or white clouds or sun, but having it be described as television tuned to a dead channel is immediately something that we're able to conjure in our mind, but also something that's like artificial. It's not something that you would immediately associate with the sky. A more modern example, I really like the opening of A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. Kel wore a very peculiar coat. It had neither one side, which would be conventional, nor two, which would be unexpected, but several, which was, of course, impossible. I love this opening line, especially because A Darker Shade of Magic, like, it is a fantasy, but I like how the first fantastical element that you're introduced to in the story is something really simple and something that you can kind of wrap your head around, but also you can tell it has this subtle sense of magic to it, this almost whimsical sense. Like a coat is an everyday object that we all know and understand, but you're adding that layer of magic to it by introducing this detail about the fact that it has all of these different sides to it that presumably all do different things. Number 2 is a theme or idea. This is like the opposite of the strange detail opening because you're starting on the big idea. It's kind of like an upside down triangle. You're showing people the wider picture and then building out the scene or the story as you go on. So it doesn't really start with anything specific, and it kind of starts with like a theme or a contemplation. I would say this opening, I feel like this one is a little bit harder to get right because when you're dealing with vagaries or abstractions, you kind of run the risk of falling into familiar phrasing because a lot of the time what makes writing feel new and fresh and punchy is being able to be specific and hone in on details that make your story your story. But when you start dealing with like vague abstractions and just contemplations on bigger themes like love, hate, romance, fame, it's hard to make that kind of abstraction feel fresh out of context. But, you know, it's been done. So of course, the most famous opening line that I think encapsulates this one is from Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Classic. She's iconic. So this immediately sets up the idea of marriage and gender roles as a big part of Pride and Prejudice, but also this feeling that that is going to be explored and challenged throughout the story. I feel like another example of this is also in The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which starts, "In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had." I would also say that this is an example of starting on an idea or a message. It's interesting that this is how The Great Gatsby starts because the author is essentially asking us right from the opening to withhold judgment before we get plunged into a story about really despicable people. I was also trying to find a more contemporary example of this in my own personal library, and I was having a lot of difficulty with that, but I thought I would also include the opening line of the Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, which starts, "My father was a king and the son of kings." This opening is really simple, it's really mundane. Honestly, it's kind of a boring sentence, but it effectively sets the theme of legacy and status, which is a huge part of what defines both the narrator of Patroclus and also his companion Achilles in different ways throughout the story. And I think it does go to show opening lines don't have to be flowery or superfluous or particularly lyrical to still be an effective opening, to still say something about your story or to accomplish whatever you want that initial opening image to be. If you have contemporary examples of this kind of opening, I would love to know because I was having a hard time kind of finding examples for this one. Next is character voice / character personality. So the approach with this opening is to hone in on who your character is and what their personality is, how they think about the world. This one can be fun, you know, you can explore your writing style, you can kind of flex a bit, but this one is really about dropping the reader right into the narrator's head, which can definitely be effective, especially when you're writing first person and you have that incredibly intimate, up close psychic distance from, you know, the reader to the narrator. Actually, one of my favorite opening lines that falls into this is the book Penguin Highway by Tomohiko Morimi. This book is not a children's book, but it is told from the perspective of this 9-year-old boy, and it starts, "I am extremely intelligent and never slack off on my studies." I love this book. I love the character voice and just how much you can tell as a reader, like how precocious this kid is, how confident he is, but he also definitely feels like a child, the way that he sees the world and the observations that he makes. Another opening line that I feel like kind of falls into this is Circe by Madeline Miller. When I was born, the name for what I was did not exist. Circe is a book about a minor goddess and a sorceress, her discovering who she is and coming into herself and her powers. When we meet her at the start of the story, she is really this like almost demure character who is on the fringes of her family and no one really understands her. And so what I like about this opening line is that I feel like it foreshadows Circe's growth, but also it immediately establishes the narrative style of the book, which is that she's narrating the book from a point in the future, and she's like going back and like telling this story in retrospect, which is like definitely one of my favorite narrative styles. Next is immediate sense of urgency and stakes. This can kind of fall into specific detail, but I think the distinction is that it drops you into like a strange situation without context. It creates a sense of urgency without really stopping to set up like why the scene is really urgent. And then the rest of the chapter or the story is gonna like contextualize that moment. So one opening line I really like is from The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. At the height of the long wet summer of the 77th year of Sendavani, the thief maker of Camor paid a sudden and unannounced visit to the eyeless priest at the temple of Perilandro, desperately hoping to sell him the Lamora boy. So Lies of Locke Lamora is obviously a fantasy. We got proper nouns out the wazoo. People have varying opinions on whether or not you should proper noun drop right in the first sentence of your book. However, I feel like this opening line does work for the simple fact that it's still comprehensible. You can still follow the flow of the sentence, and you really only need to understand one thing, which is that last part, desperately hoping to sell the Lamora boy. We know that Locke Lamora is our main character, and what we can grasp from the sentence is that why is he being sold? What did he do? How did he get here? That first part, at the height of the long wet summer, is something that we can all kind of tangibly feel, like a humid, oppressive, muggy type environment. And then all the proper nouns in the middle, we don't need to really spend too much time thinking about that. And so, yeah, I feel like this is an example of an opening line that just brings you into a situation with no context and you just read on to see what happens. I feel like I could find a lot of different examples of this in science fiction or fantasy. I don't have like an extensive literary fiction collection, but I feel like you can also see this type of example in books that start with dialogue, like drop you into the middle of a conversation. There's a lot of contemporary books that do that, and I feel like that kind of falls into this type of opening. And another interesting example that I feel like could also fall into this type of opening is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, which starts 19 years before she decided to die. Nora Seed sat in the warmth of the small library at Hazeldean School in the town of Bedford. You have, again, that first part. It's that kind of initial 19 years before she decided to die that is really striking. And again, is an example of not stopping to explain it first. You're just introduced immediately to the concept of Nora wanting to die, and you just have to read on. The last example that I will talk about is a scene and atmosphere. This one's also like kind of vague. It's a pretty common type of opening, but it also comes in a lot of different ways because, for example, you know, just describe the room or describe the weather, and it is really common. It can be cliche, but it all depends on your execution and also like establishing your narrative voice. This one I feel like can also overlap with like the other ones that I've mentioned. Like it could overlap a little bit with character voice or with strange detail depending on how you choose to approach it. But I want to talk about it separately because I feel like there are some like cliches when it comes to openings, like starting with a character waking up from a dream or starting by describing the sky or whatever. And while I do think that it can be cliche, again, as I've said, it's all about how you approach it and what details you choose to kind of curate to make it feel fresh or make it feel specific to the tone and the atmosphere that you're trying to set up. So one example that I have is from the YA novel Patron Saints of Nothing by Randy Rebay. It was a day of soil, sunlight, and smoke. One thing I like about this opening is that it feels like it appeals to multiple sensations. Soil, sunlight, and smoke is obviously just really nice, simple alliteration. But I also feel like the word soil kind of makes me think of my hands. It's kind of tactile. Sunlight is like warm on your skin and also bright. And then smoke is something I feel like I can smell. If you've ever been in a writing workshop, you've maybe heard before teachers tell you not to like start sentences with "it was," because the word was, or I mean the verb to be, is like the most boring verb that you can use, and typically there's like a better verb usually. Every time you want to say something is or something exists, writing teachers will always tell you there's a better way to say that. There's a better verb that you can use. And while I understand the sentiment, like I agree to a certain extent, I also feel like sometimes the "it was," she makes points, you know? Sometimes it's the simplicity that matters. Another example that I've written down for this section is the opening of The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. The audacity of this line. This line's just, she's kind of audacious. Like, I don't know what it is, man. There's just something about that phrase, a silence of 3 parts, intriguing. The paragraph and the rest of the scene goes on to basically explain the silences, the sense of uneasiness throughout this inn. But the way that it's described it's audacious. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet made by things that were lacking. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees, set the inn's sign creaking on its hooks, and brushed the silence down the road like trailing autumn leaves. If there had been a crowd, even a handful of men inside the inn, they would have filled the silence with conversation and laughter, the clatter and clamor one expects from a drinking house during the dark hours of night. If there had been music. But no, of course there was no music. In fact, there were none of these things, and so the silence remained. I mean, essentially this prologue is just saying it was quiet, an unsettling sort of quiet. But I just really like how the concept of the unsettling quiet is like broken down in this very extensive way. So these were just some examples from my own little collection, but I hope this was helpful, hope this was fun. I would love to know what some of your favorite opening lines are, or if you have any interesting ways that you like to approach your openings. That is all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.
Now I can't even stay close to you. But who do I call if it ain't you?